Norman Conquests, and yeah, the box is a little too close, and I'm gonna be a little off, whatever. Pull it back there. So I have been subscribing to the Men of Iron series since it began, which, you know, came out just about when I got back into gaming. I was already a fan of Richard Berg, you know, aware of his flaws, but as a designer, yes, also as a person, but he could be very prickly. But he's also very amusing. And it was very sad to hear his passing a while back, and also very worried that, you know, some of his franchises like this would go away. It's good to see that somebody's taking a crack at them. I'm not going to talk a hell of a lot about the Men of Iron series as a whole, although I will talk about a little bit about where it's changed. The rulebook has gotten more bloated, trying to nail everything down. That started with Infidel, to tell you the truth. People were like confused by the original Men of Iron. Even I made it a mistaken interpretation, and I'm like, well, that's interesting. But I was fine with playing it wrong, and it kind of didn't bother me. Of course, I'm one of those people who doesn't really care that much if I get it right, as long as I'm comfortable with the rules and can look it up and be consistent with them. And then I worry about, well, that seems weird, you know, if it does, and this didn't. But anyway, this sucker comes with, I don't know, a bunch of maps. How many battles is the issue? 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different battles. Unfortunately, many of which I already had some coverage of somewhere or another. Sometimes multiple coverages of, like with Hastings. You know, it's a period that I'm interested in, but I like this system well enough. Actually, two of the battles at least, I had coverage from the predecessor to this whole system. About as different from Men of Iron as Men of Iron is from these. You can see that it's the same system in play, sort of a lightened Great Battles of History. Component-wise, everything's fine, you know, for the most part. You know, it's GMT. If you're used to GMT games, you're good with what it gives you. I'm sure there's people who did unboxings. I've shown a lot of it within the game. It uses the same rule book as the tri-pack uses, which is a clever idea, I guess. But ends up putting a lot of stuff in little colored boxes in the rules for you know, games that you don't have when you buy this. It's okay. Some of the counters, man, some of the informational counters I'm not thrilled with. The naming on them and whatnot. I go into that and give my bitches within the context of the game, within the context of the playthroughs. This is just my normal bitching about, you know, whatever confuses me or whatever. But I do think that some of the naming choices could have been better. This is right from the beginning. I guess the biggest questions, one, in terms of a marginal enhancement to your collection, what does this give you? Because I wouldn't suggest this necessarily, there's nothing wrong with it, but I wouldn't suggest it necessarily as your first Men of Iron game. You're probably better off getting the tri-pack. Just in terms of cost to the amount of stuff you get. You know, you get three of the games, and I'm not sure which three. Let me think. You're going to get obviously Men of Iron and Infidel, and I am guessing Arquebus, but I'm not sure. And between Men of Iron and Infidel, well, you're getting a lot of stuff that feels kind of like some of these. Now, if you're really, really interested in this early medieval era, Men of Iron has some stuff that kind of stretch. Men of Iron is later. Infidel is a very specific time. It's a little later, a little bit more Cav engagement for the most part. Although this does, once you get into the Barons' War scenarios and whatnot, it's later on. However, the armies aren't as Cav heavy as the ones that show up in Infidel. So this does have a place. I think there is a marginal increment to anybody who already likes the system and whatnot. If you're particularly interested in this sort of weird bracketing, because it's a 200-year period, right? From basically, essentially the Norman conquests of Italy. You only have one scenario for that. I really was expecting this being titled Norman Conquest to handle more of the Italian stuff and whatnot. Kind of disappointing that it had like the Barons' Wars in it, which to me that's in the post. You're no longer talking Normans anymore when you're talking Henry III, Edward I, Montfort. You're really getting away from that. I think up to Tinchebrai, everything's good, but here's the thing. In terms of research, Berg had already done research on Lewis and Evesham. And so it was easy for the Simon Says package, which was a predecessor to this, which makes it easier, to include those. So it may have been that the plan was to do other battles, but there was just kind of a, hey, we can get these two battles in a lot cheaper, and where are we going to put them? I don't know, There's not a lot of battles in the Barons' War. So although Clash of Arms put out a box set of the Barons' War, I think it only includes those two battles. They certainly could have fit another one in at least, but in terms of, I don't have that game. I have the King's War. Batteries. Charger is giving me some grief here. I really need it to work because I'm going to do rules very soon. Anyway, so in terms of that kind of marginal impact, if you're me, you're just like, I like this system so much, I'm willing to, pick it up for really, I played all the battles in it. And this is a more polished design than the Simon Says one, which was really, that's the biggest hit for me, is that this had two scenarios from Simon Says. But it also had 5 other scenarios, and I feel like this does a better job. Kind of wish I hadn't hunted down Simon Says, but nah, it's kind of cool. Just, it's not, it's not like these cost a lot of time to play, and it's not like I couldn't afford, whatever amount of money that was, it wasn't a huge amount. I wasn't going to spend a ton on it. Anyway. I really do like, And this returns more to the Men of Iron feel than anything else. Every game since Men of Iron has added more complexity and felt a little bit clunkier and everything. And sure, the rules are still that way, have still expanded in that way. But the actual scenarios feel kind of like Men of Iron scenarios to me, which are really like these kind of dice fests. Yeah, there's some things I'm not thrilled with, like the introduction of the seizure opportunity chits. I could get rid of them and go back to the old seizure system. I liked it better. I know some people must not have liked it because it changed. I got a little confused about the zones of control situation because I remembered that, I think, wrongly or something. I thought you stopped when you entered an enemy influence tax. That's not the case. It just costs you more movement points to enter. But it's all fine. And outside of that, though, this feels much more, you're throwing mainly infantry armies up against each other with a little bit of cav for spice. Infidel threw a lot of cav in it, and you had different tactical systems facing each other. Here, the only place where you have a different tactical system facing, where you have two different tactical systems really facing each other, I would say is when you hit Hastings, because the Normans are using a very different technique than the Saxons are. Now, the Saxons and Norwegians are using the same, and the Normans are largely using the same civitas. Probably is different, but it's not all that clear that it really is to me, because the game doesn't go into that much detail to really distinguish between, how Norman horsemen were used versus how Italian horsemen were used and stuff along those lines. There would be some differences. I don't even know if that had horsemen in it. I don't think so. I think it had dismounted men-at-arms. But yeah, the Norman use of cavalry was a major innovation, essentially, which gained them a lot of ground. But everybody kind of caught up to it relatively quickly. All the other battles are basically forces that are very similar. You could argue that last battle, Evesham, with the Welsh are a little different with their longbows and whatnot, but they're kind of a non-factor in it. To some extent, though, the fact that it's kind of like Men of Iron and kind of reminds me of it and has actually less variance in terms of how the battles are. The battles feel like fairly similar engagements to one another. That's a negative in terms of giving you any kind of marginal utility from this game, because you probably there's at least one scenario in Men of Iron that covers what most of these do. So in the tri-pack, you've got at least one thing that feels kind of like most of these. And most of these have a certain sameness to them that might also disappoint some people. I'm cool with it because, again, to me, these are beer and pretzel, dice chucking with high randomness factors, with those 10-siders that can go all over the place. And you can get a fair variance of results. That said, I found some little issues that feel wrong historically in these. And I gotta say, it swings through most of the scenarios that I played, which is that the infantry units are too effective, like the pike units, which are essentially just spearmen, are too effective on offense in too many of the battles. You could tweak the system to fix that, but I think that's actually the core of the problem, is that what's generally viewed as not a very powerful offensive arm is doing too good a job in too many of these fights. And it's doing too good a job against other infantry, and it's doing too good a job against horsemen even. Although the horsemen have some possibility to withdraw, once they start taking hits, they can be mauled by the defensive forces. This may be a strict designer choice. I would not be shocked by that. And as such, I don't want to argue with it or anything. My knowledge is, I'm sure, less than the designer's knowledge of the situation at this time. You don't design a game without immersing yourself. So he may have come up with something, but there are no designer's notes to really express this issue. And that troubles me. When you don't give me designer's notes in a game, and it doesn't meet your expectations. If it just meets expectations and you kind of say, yeah, that seems about right. So there were two factors that I felt really aided the attacker in most situations. One is those attacking pike forces, or spearmen, were too effective. Even shitty ones that wouldn't be able to hold up defensively were able to attack relatively effectively offensively. That can be changed very easily. You got a little tactical matrix here. They've already got a penalty hitting mounted men-at-arms and dismounted men-at-arms. They're bonused on unhorsed. Maybe they shouldn't be, maybe they should. I don't care about that too much. But here's the thing. I would think about putting a -1 on pike attacking pike. I know that sounds probably kind of heretic, but by not putting that there, they're just too effective on the offensive. And they start feeling a little bit too much like phalanx units hitting each other. I actually feel like they should be given an advantage on the defensive against their own kind. And maybe other values should be modified as well. I'm not so sure, but you'd have to tweak and play around with it. But that's what I feel is that for the most part, those spearmen are too good on the offensive. There are other ways you could tweak around with it by improving their defensive value, but then they become too good against other types of units, and stuff along that line. You could also make them worse defensively, but that just makes the problem worse. The real problem, now there might be other solutions, which might be introducing two different types of pike unit, or saying pike units that have, a plus or even a 0 value for their defensive value should get that -1 on attack or something like that. There's a little bit of jumbling around. The other thing that really favored the attacker that I saw in this, and not, de Montfort was able to use it on the attack when he might not have been the attacker per se in the battle, is how effective outflanks can be. Some of that may have been me misplaying the zones of control, thinking back to the old zones of control, and because I did find it a little harder in the de Montfort scenario, where I was definitely aware of, wait a minute, I should be paying an extra movement point to move next to an enemy unit, which slows down especially the infantry in being able to outflank. But look, the archers can slip around behind you and shoot you and set things up. The mounted men-at-arms can move into place to get a charge from the flank. I just found outflanking operations a little too powerful. Now, especially notable to me is at Hastings, where that was not even attempted. as far as I know. It was pretty much a flat attack going up against the hill. And the way the battle played out on this, the Normans just kind of went around the side and smashed into the Saxon position. And the problem is the game allows for a lot of flexibility in terms of being able to, especially if you have good commanders and whatnot, being able to be very reactive and keep engaging the same units in the battle. So if you start an outflank and you get a lucky roll or two or whatever, you know, you have the command advantage or whatever, you're going to be very, very capable of performing an effective outflank against the enemy. That's just the system, and I don't know how you get around that. I think in most battles it works okay. I think there's something missing in Hastings in terms of maybe some special rules to avoid that. I hate that idea. Some way, maybe the initial setup is wrong. Maybe the terrain needs to be fixed a little bit. I don't know what, but the kind of outflank that I was able to achieve was just not a part of that battle. And I've seen other games handle the battle much, much more easily or much, much more accurately. Now, that's a battle where I would actually say that the pikes. See, here's the thing: the Norman footmen were not necessarily all that effective. They weren't terrible. The Saxon axemen should be good. Those are the Huscarls. Those should be very good. The Fyrd, which is going to be your spearmen, a little bit less, but they might have been maybe should have been better than the Normans. I think giving a penalty, so I think you might have to tweak values all over the place if you started putting that, okay, pike versus pike gives you a -1. It just feels to me like the battle values aren't creating the kind of battle that was appropriate. And that the Fyrd was able to hold up pretty well defensively and thereby deserved good defensive values. And they were able to push forward the attack offensively, so they might not deserve that -1. It was really the disruption that their advance forward caused that forced the Saxon army to start taking real losses after they were lured down the hill a little bit. Other battles I'm a lot less familiar with from this series, so I tend to, say, okay, I don't know. I can't speak really, really heavily as to these, and there may not be a hell of a lot of information about those. I mean, it's not like there's a huge amount about Hastings even. But that's the one that I have the most familiarity with, and this game did not provide something that felt like Hastings, and also across the board it didn't provide something that felt like medieval warfare of the era. And I just feel like some of the numbers have been gotten wrong. And I don't know, it's hard to tinker with a system like this. If we take a look, see, Men of Iron came at a different time. In many ways, but it represents a different time of battles, where, what are we looking, real paper. So the GMT rule books now are this Synthopaper stuff. 2005, so this came out before I got back in, but I picked it up. What is this? This is just the base rules. Rebirth of Infantry. We're looking at 1300 for the first. going until the mid 14th century. So, yeah, this is a really nice slice of time where, yeah, the rebirth of infantry, right? Oh my, this is the Agincourt scenario. Somebody's leaked out the cross of St. George. Oh, where the fuck that goes. Counters are thinner in the old version. I'm sure if you get the tri-pack, it's modern GMT quality stuff across the board. So here you have pike infantry versus pike infantry gives you a 0. And that may be the cause of the issue here, is that this was a point where infantry was beginning to be better trained, was beginning to provide a more solid basis. Now that might not be the case in all of the battles across the board, but it caused less difficulty in this later era. Whereas I feel that this Norman Conquest box contains multiple layers of different tactical systems, and that pike is not the right term for all of the spearmen that are being represented here. It really isn't. Pike is fitting for a Schiltron. Pike is fitting for the Swiss. Pike is not fitting for what's being represented in this game. And I think a little bit more care should have been taken and a little bit more thought, because it really doesn't feel like this is generating battles that are creating, the right situation. The outflank situation is another problem, though. There's a little too much mobility and fluidity in this system. And that is able to cause the outflank. I'm not saying that you never saw outflanks in medieval warfare, but they were a lot less common, mainly because these sort of disorganized spear units were not really all that mobile. And again, it's a beer and pretzel system. When you're not fighting Hastings, you can kind of look and say, wow, the attack is really bonused in this. How do I fix that? Well, some of it is, I'm pretty sure, just in the numbers themselves on the tactical matrix and on the counters. And that some kind of tweaking should be in place there. And that's actually where I say this one is at its weakest. And why, look, it's fun to chuck dice and it's fun to play it, but it doesn't really feel right, And maybe it feels better with, like, where it really feels weak is when you're looking at, like, the Norman era of spearmen, because they were not, the level of the best of the Saxon or Norwegian troops. And they should not be at the level of those later. When you get to the Barons' War, I think they're still too potent there. We're not talking about, we're just not talking about the 1300s yet. We're looking at 1265. It's another 50 years for you to get to the Men of Iron games. And the Men of Iron system and values were determined for a particular period when infantry was beginning to shine. And that's what every scenario in that showed. Everything else it shouldn't even be the Men of Iron series. It should have been called something else. Unfortunately, it's Men of Iron Volume 5. Men of Iron was supposed to be the infantry. The series should have been given another name, like Great Battles of the Medieval Era, because Berg likes to call it, great battles. Great battles, great leaders was one of his. You know, he likes that great battles in there. I feel like it was misnamed, and that may have caused some of the problem with an unwillingness to adapt the tactical charts the way that Great Battles of History adapted the tactical charts. Because GBOH really, really does focus on, you know what? In this period, this is what the valuations of, you know, this is what these interactions were like, as opposed to looking and just saying, yeah, spearmen, that's like pikemen, right? Let's just call it all the same thing and let's keep the value there. And you got to realize, you look at what came, again, Men of Iron was the beginning of the resurgence of infantry. Infidel obviously happens kind of during this period, but it's a very, very specialized and weird situation. And I don't feel like the infantry is particularly valuable in the infidel set. Arquebus and Blood and Roses are coming significantly after Men of Iron. Once trained infantry formations are really kind of a norm. This one sits in a weird place. And I just don't feel like it's doing justice, especially over the broad span of battles that it's covering. Again, 200 years of technology and you know, soft technology, essentially, and learning, right? Learning that the Norman cav-heavy force kind of made infantry obsolete. And then slowly, you know, so you have good cav being broken, or good infantry being broken by cav at Hastings, and in some of the later in some of the later battles that you know, William's involved in, which I think there was at least one in here. I don't remember. Do we have one of the battles against? He had some rebellions and whatnot facing him. Did we get one or not? I don't remember. Tinchbury? No, we go right to Tinchbury, which is significantly later, and by that point, the infantry has already been degraded. You know, infantry is no longer the arm that it was for anyone. So yeah, so this should really be documenting and showing that rise of the cav. And it picked good battles for it to begin with. You know, you're picking the Norwegian Saxon. You're showing off the Normans versus the Italian infantry. You're showing them off against the Saxons. You're showing a picture of what should be two very similar armies with the Saxons and Norwegians that are very infantry heavy, that have sort of an elite infantry in the axemen, and a better trained spearman. I feel like there's a battle missing in there. Something else to show that Norman cav being effective against infantry. And then once you get to Tinchbury, and from then on, you're on that pattern of the cav-heavy army, and the infantry should never be that effective again. So, yeah. And here I wander and blunder, but so this becomes less of a review and more of a, what exactly is going wrong with this? And I feel like there is something vitally wrong with this particular package. I had enough fun with it that I rate it well, that I'm glad I got it and everything, but I do question its historical value just based on feel. Just based on feel. The movement is a little too fluid, allowing the outflanks, and the infantry is a little too powerful, especially on attack. All right. Those is my thoughts. Let's send it up.